Everybody gets messages like that from God, right? So clear cut. So, today's story starts out with these adults that are behaving like spoiled children, whining about what they want. And it references what the high society folks thought about John the Baptist and contrasts that image with their opinion of Jesus. It was a metaphor that Jesus used to offer his take on the generation in which he lived. What's changed? How often are we blind to the opportunities of the moment or distracted by our own cares? We don't want anything violent to happen to us, but do we think about the consequences on other families every time there is a drone strike? We gripe about corporations only being concerned about their profits, but we don't want anybody else making more than minimum wage for fear of what it will cost us. We miss the nuances, the gray areas, because we have this penchant for wanting things clear-cut, black and white. The second part of the gospel that was read this morning tells us it's not hopeless. That wisdom will be revealed to those who can listen with the open, eager to learn mind of a child. How many times have any of us prayed for wisdom, but then we don't take the necessary steps to simplify our lives? You can't have one without the other. You have to decide what you really need to carry. What keeps us from letting go of baggage? To get the historical perspective of this, we need to recall what a yoke is. In the New Revised Standard Version, it talks about, Jesus says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, a yoke is the wooden contraption that harnesses a beast of burden to its load. So it also has a human adaptation for carrying heavy loads on one's shoulders. Jesus recognized the Jewish law as applied in his day as a heavy burden on the people. And this was his way of telling all these overburdened folks that he was releasing them from the restrictions that were keeping all of the oppressed from living the lives that God intends. Another meaning for yoke in Jesus' day was the Roman army would force a defeated foe to march underneath what was called a yoke of spears. It was to signify their final humiliation and capitulation to Roman authority. So just as our forebears had the fervor of freedom in 1776, so too the people of the occupied Holy Lands yearned for political freedom. I'm certain that Jesus sympathized with those feelings, but it wasn't the kind of independence that he was preaching. Now, if you're a history buff, it's hard not to imagine celebrating the 4th of July without considering the impact of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson, of course, is the main author of our Declaration of Independence, and it's John Adams that was credited with foretelling how the birth of our nation would forever be celebrated all across America with fireworks. Jefferson and Adams were actually bitter political rivals. But as they aged, they eventually resolved their differences and developed a deep mutual respect and friendship for one another. You might even say they were intertwined in death as they died within a few hours of each other on July 4th in 1826. Now, Jefferson compiled a writing he called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, in which he literally took a penknife to his Bible and cut out all of the mentions of miracles and angels and prophecy and, yes, the resurrection. Jefferson intended to include, I quote, the very words only of Jesus. So he eliminated all the elements that he considered irrational. Jefferson considered that Jesus' teachings were enough to know. Are you tired? Worn out, burned out on religion? Jesus' questions ring as relevant today as when he originally asked them. The servant class and the working poor were exhausted from the day-to-day demands on their bodies to serve privileged masters while eking out a subsistence living. And those with any wealth would have been busy trying to accumulate more wealth. They'd have been tired of trying to hide any amounts of it from the tax collectors. They'd have been worn out doing the things with their money to show off how much money they had. Any of this sound familiar? For both the poor and the privileged. Does it sound like today? One thing the two classes of people had in common was being burned out by religion. The Pharisees held the people to a standard of upholding all the Jewish laws at the expense of actually doing what the laws were intended to do, which was to help the people live lives closer to God. The rules replaced intent. Jesus was attempting to correct this. And our human tendency to keep chasing after that brass ring. Simple, right? So simple it got Jesus killed. The world tells us we should be spending our time chasing self-satisfaction. The world conspires against our children and families by scheduling activities that conflict with our worship times. Some churches consider what we do here in this church to be anti-God. We don't adhere to the rules. We're accused of being the Antichrist because we don't make distinctions about who is worthy. And now we're hanging out with Muslims. The donations you gave to the Syrian refugees brought tears to their eyes and smiles to their faces. You know, while we complain about the weather and the traffic, they have endured more than we can possibly imagine. Your kindness helped them experience a taste of the peaceful life that is possible in America when diversity is accepted. This year's trip was different from last year's for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we met 7 new families. But it wasn't just us meeting the families. We were with a representative of the Al-Azhar Mosque in Youngstown, who also brought as many donations as what we took. And 10 or so teenage young men from the Turkish mosque in Liberty, who also brought, a dozen or so gift baskets. The Syrian families got to see these Christians and Muslims, all Americans, getting along with one another, uniting for the purpose of showing true hospitality. The author of the Declaration of Independence edited all the things that he thought Jesus didn't really say or do. Do we edit our words and actions at our convenience? And we misquote Jesus all the time, either with mistaken good intentions or to serve our own opinions. Now, this week with parades and picnics and fireworks and flags, what words of Jesus will you remember and live? Which words will you use or misuse or throw away? What will you choose to carry? Now, Jefferson and Adams resolved their differences to develop a mutual respect. Have you been holding back from being truly welcoming to all because your baggage is already monogrammed? Now, as Americans, we rightly celebrate our independence. Jesus has a different kind of celebration in mind. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Put another way, Jesus says, come to me and you'll recover your life. Walk with me and work with me. I won't lay anything heavy or hard on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely. That is the promise of true independence. Have a happy 4th, and amen.